Okay, thanks everybody. We'll try to get started while you find your seats. My name is Jeremy Shapiro. I'm the Research Director at the European Council on Foreign Relations. We're going to talk today a little bit about the domestic polarization in the United States and its effect on U.S. foreign policy. The billboard that you see behind you, Democrats Hate You, was sent to us from it's a Republican Party billboard from the Atlanta, Georgia 2020 campaign. It was this was a picture sent to us by Maida Ruga's sister, a Bosnian refugee who settled in the U.S. state of Georgia during the war in Bosnia. She said about the 2020 election in Georgia that she had never seen this level of, well, balkanization. So we wanted to understand in this project how this level of brutal polarization in the United States was playing out in foreign policy. And so Maida Ruga, whose sister was instrumental, Celia Belen, and I looked at the implications of this through the lens of the 2024 election, which, as I mentioned, is only 18 months away, so we had to hurry. I think that the first thing to understand about foreign policy in the presidential elections is that what we sort of call the American Zeitenwende of 2016. The fact that Trump really very much broke elite control over foreign policy in the Republican Party. And the Republican foreign policy elite, we would argue, has never recovered from the destruction of their influence. The Democratic foreign policy elite, by contrast, does maintain control over the policymaking apparatus in foreign policy in a way that is not really present in the Republican Party. But it is trying to avoid what happened to the Democrats, to the Republicans happening to them. And so what they are trying to do, and in essence what both parties are trying to do, is create some sort of foreign policy for the middle class or the white working class, depending on how you think about it. So from this perspective, within the presidential campaigns, the white working class has really become the key constituency for formulating a political program of foreign policy. And it's not just because of the number of voters that they represent, although they do represent quite a lot of voters, but it's also because they are the swing voters in the swing states, principally in the upper Midwest. And it is the received wisdom, questioned by some, that it is control over those voters which really makes the difference in the presidential elections. Of course, having said all that, foreign policy, as is often noted, is not very important in U.S. elections. But let's understand what that means. For the 2024 election, it means that formulating a foreign policy program is about creating a foreign policy that appeals to the white working class voters. It's about creating a foreign policy that is about strength, about demonstrating that the president has control over the fate of the nation, and about issues where foreign policy, the few issues where foreign policy does matter in the daily life of white working class voters, principally things like immigration and trade, and through trade, the issue of China. So what this means is that both parties are moving somewhat away from the internationalist positions that have characterized their elites. The Republicans are doing this with significantly more rhetorical flair than the Democrats, and are moving much more quickly. And to give you some sense of this, I thought we would contrast the just retired senator from Ohio, Rob Portman, with his successor, the just elected Senator JD Vance from Ohio. These two people are from the same party, and they hold, in succession, the same seat in the U.S. Senate. Senator Portman was the co-chair of the Senate's Ukraine caucus, and a Republican champion of American support for Ukraine. The MAGA star, as he's often called, JD Vance, has made clear that he would not authorize a penny for Ukraine. And you can see that they have a very different perspective on a whole bunch of different issues. I would say that most of the Republican caucus in both the Senate and the House still resembles Portman rather than Vance, but the direction of travel, I think, is clear, and it's moving in Vance's direction. The need to appeal to the white working class implies that there will be a lot of continuity and similarities between Republicans and Democrats on issues that are important to the white working class. And these are principally, there's several, but the sort of three that we thought to highlight are trade and strategic industrial policy, forever wars, and the idea of ending U.S. military interventions in various parts of the world, and at least the economic parts of the China agenda. There are more room for differences on issues that move beyond the white working class issues, and there's a lot of issues like that. Almost all of the traditional foreign policy issues are in that category. We just highlighted a few here, particularly climate, Russia, and allies, because we thought they'd be of interest. But I would maybe highlight just since it was a subject of our first panel, the trade and industrial policy issue, which is to me the most novel and interesting area in which you see greater convergence. And this is, I would argue, a huge revolution for both parties, but especially the Republicans. So here we have Jake Sullivan, who's the current national security advisor for President Biden, and Peter Navarro, who was a pretty hardline economic advisor for President Trump, sounding very similar on industrial policy, supply chains, and even economic relations with China. And to me, this does reflect the ways in which the parties are converging on certain issues. In the first panel, Carl Bildt and Arantxa Gonzalez emphasized that it's very important that industrial policy not move from, stay in the realm of security and not move into the realm of competition. But I would note that the white working class issue implies that for American politicians of both parties, it will be very much about competition. And I think even the small quotes here demonstrate that it's already moving in the ways that they hoped it wouldn't into competition and arguably even mercantilism. Russia, I think, is the most interesting area of divergence between the two parties. It's not inherently a white working class issue, so there's a lot of room for disagreement. I think a lot of the two leading Republican presidential candidates that are highlighted here are trying to put the Russia-Ukraine conflict in the frame of forever wars, and this is working. This, I think, will work fairly well in the primaries, and so you can see both front runners in the Republican primaries are doing it. But I would say that Democrats and congressional Republicans are by and large trying to avoid that frame and still making appeals on the Russia-Ukraine issue to leadership and world order, which I wouldn't say they're important to the white working class, but they at least don't create opposition. As this level of divergence implies, a lot in the disagreement category will depend on the tribes within the parties. So who wins? And in our paper we described a bunch of different, three different tendencies within each party. So who wins the nomination and who is appointed to staff the administration will have a big impact on the issues of divergence that we're highlighting here, including this one. It's also, though, however, important to note that the campaign itself will have a big impact on governance, and the issues that presidential candidates tend to take positions on tend to get reflected in their governance. In other words, believe it or not, they actually keep their promises. But of course, a lot of issues won't be debated in the campaign, so there will still be a lot of room for the disputes within the parties to have it make a difference. So we've described in the paper that both parties have what we call foreign policy tribes, a word we used advisedly. The Republicans definitely have more intellectual firmament. They're a lot more fun to watch. And we see three basic strains, which we've created more detail for in the paper. There's first the restrainers, who are more interested in more focused on issues at home, and believe that security begins at home and that peace comes through strength. And we represented them here by Marjorie Taylor Greene. I don't know why, but she's just the most picturesque. There are plenty of them, and Trump is really in this category. The prioritizers, represented here by Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri, see Asia as the big challenge, and believe that the core U.S. foreign policy focus should be on leadership in Asia. The primicists, represented by Mitch McConnell, again, I'm not sure why, believe in a sort of traditional policy of global leadership, and that represents, I think, still most of the congressional caucus. The primicists really dominate elite debate in Washington. If you go to Washington, if you speak to Congress, if you speak to the Republican think tanks, you will hear mostly primicist theory. If you go, what's interesting about it is that the restrainers really dominate the political debate, and that's why both the front runners in the Republican primaries are talking about certainly Trump in the restrainer realm, maybe DeSantis. Prioritizers are certainly the smallest group, but they probably are where the Republican Party, or the Republican governance, I should say, will end up, because their focus on China appeals to both leadership concerns of the elite and the economic concerns of the base, and they just represent a compromise. The Democrats, I think, are a lot more constrained by the fact that they have an administration in power, and the debates really happen much more behind the scenes. It's quite difficult, frankly, to surface these debates. We tried. We do find sort of three schools represented by the progressives, the realists, and the leaders. The progressives want to redirect the U.S. role toward a more value-laden approach that pushes progressive ideas onto the international agenda. We represented that by Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who's a very prominent and very young congresswoman from New York, who's just, I think, waiting to become of age before she runs for president. The realists are interested in a more limited role, but still quite focused more on national interests, but still quite interested in an internationalist position. And then that's represented by Senator Chris Murphy, who would probably dispute that characterization, but we needed somebody. And then the more traditional role is the sort of leadership approach, which is, I think, the approach roughly of the administration. We represented it here by Alyssa Slotkin, who is a congresswoman from Michigan and is probably going to be the next senator from Michigan. I thought it was important to show that that actually there is a sort of growing coterie of emerging Democrats who are taking up this mantle. I think that these debates are still important for the future, but they're more of an issue for future campaigns and for future administrations. So with that, I think I wanted to, there is, as our dear leader likes to say, only one thing left to do in this presentation, and that is our bookshelf segment. So on my bookshelf is the paper by myself, Celia Berlin, and Maida Ruga, which covers all of this, called Brace Yourself, How the 2024 Presidential Election Will Affect Europe. So I would definitely commend that to you. It's a great read. But in the meantime, I'd like to welcome Maida and the panel up to talk about the effect of U.S. politics on Europe.